pragmatically speaking, atheists always want to appeal to pragmatic arguments. So, oh, it doesn't work. Christianity doesn't work. It leads to oppression. It leads to superstition. It's this, that. Do atheist societies actually work? I don't think so. I mean, again, the problem here is that when we use the word work assumes that we have some sort of gradation, some sort of benchmark, some sort of value judgment by which we can determine and assess whether things do or do not work, right? So that's, once again, to say that atheist societies work, that's going to be conditioned on your presuppositions themselves. You're going to read what works based on your presuppositions, right? So, for example, if I think that it's good to depopulate, and I killed off most, Georgia Guidestones, let's say we kill off most of the world, or something like this, down to 500 million. If I believe that is good, then I think that works. If I think that works, I believe it's good, right? So the problem with pragmatism is that it on the one hand assumes a objective standard, while at the same time typically denying objective standards. And that's incoherent. That's a contradiction. That's being illogical. It's a violation of logic. So the point being is that if we want to be pragmatic and we want to say, well, does it work? Well, if you are anti-human, I guess it does work, right? I mean, if you think that it's good to have some sort of entity that enacts mass death or something like this, a communist state, a technocratic state that's going to depopulate on a mass scale, then it does work, right? Now, I know that there could be atheists who say, well, we don't want that. We want, the Charter of Human Rights or something like this. But again, the reason here, the argument I'm making here is that there is no reason to prefer one or the other, right? If you try to say that, well, we should protect the life of XYZ and we should not protect the life of ABC, there's no real objective reason to delineate between why we should or should not, because shoulds and should nots are the domain of ethics. And in this worldview, there's absolutely no coherent basis for objective ethics. Now, I know that there are atheist philosophers who think that they can give a basis for some kind of objective ethics or secular ethics or something like this, but they can't. Because there's no such thing, again, as objective standards. There's no such thing as metaphysics in this position, because most modern atheism, again, maybe you can find a guy here or there, but most modern atheism comes out of the tradition of David Hume, the classic skeptic, the denial of metaphysics and the denial of these sort of absolute concrete metaphysical principles. And when you do that, you kind of box yourself in, and you're limited in the options of where you can go in terms of things like ethics. And so I would say that atheism actually doesn't work, and it doesn't produce a, quote, healthy society. Because what we conceive of as healthy and what we conceive of as working is actually going to be based on our presuppositions. And if our presuppositions are false or incorrect, then they're going to lead to incorrect conclusions. And so if, for example, we look at, say, radical anarchism as an atheist position, or if we look at radical socialism or communism or dictatorship, fascism, whatever, as perhaps then really all you have is a dialectic at work. There's no reason to prefer or to think that one is better than the other. Now, you might like the individual anarcho position better because maybe it affords you the opportunity to engage in more personal pleasures or something like that. But on what basis does that mean that's actually true, right? So because you prefer or you enjoy more pleasures within a libertarian anarcho system of atheism as opposed to a collectivist system of atheism, it's just completely arbitrary and ad hoc. There's actually not a reason for one or the other. And to say, well, it's just what I want, that's called being arbitrary. That's called being ad hoc. That's not actually giving a reason. That's just being subjective. So once again, it always boils, if you look at the debate with JF, you look at the debate with any of the other atheists I've had, it always boils back down to subjectivism. And even if you bring in things like universally preferred behavior or something like that, that's just as arbitrary. It's just as ad hoc. And it's just as subjective and not able to be grounded in objective principles. Because again, atheism is grounded in a movement against objective metaphysical principles. 99% of the time. The next argument I would say is that ultimately then atheism is anti-human. Now, again, if you're an atheist, there's a tension in a lot of atheism between, on the one hand, wanting to be We're secular humanists. We believe in the, good of man and man rising up and the power of human reason. And at the same time, man is conceived of as this buffoon, this entity that's a kind of cancer on Mother Earth that, most humans, because they don't have, IQ 150 or above, we got to get rid of all of them. And so there's this dialectical tension between humanism, so-called, and on the other hand, anti-humanism, right? And when you get to the root of the humanist movement, you'll see that most of them, they're not humanists. They want most people to die. I mean, look at the history of the depopulation movement. Look at the Rockefeller Foundation. Look at the communist regimes, all the murder, all this stuff. When you try to instantiate these utopian kind of systems, they lead to disaster because this world is not utopian. And it leads to disaster because atheism itself is a false philosophy. It doesn't work. It actually is not pragmatic, although it claims to be pragmatic. So I would say that when you have a system where there's no image of God, where man's not made in the image of God, then all human rights are worthless and meaningless. There's not really any human rights because you're not damaging. You're not being held to an objective standard because all standards are relative. All right. So atheism is the dehumanization of man, and the global elite actually understand that, and that's why they foster atheism, to demoralize and to brutalize you so that you are then more malleable for the social engineering, right? From soy wars, from video games, from all the replacement stuff that you get from the system to make you feel like you're a male, to give you synthetic masculinity, sports, all this nonsense, right? Those are all your replacement masculine idols, right? Which really ultimately you would get in being grounded in real philosophy, being grounded in real metaphysics, real epistemology, ultimately in theology, right? So all of this stuff is a replacement for that. Next, I would say that atheism is materialistic, ultimately. Most of the time, again, 99%. You could have an atheist who believes, we just live in a dream simulation. We just live in some kind of like matrix. It's all Maya, it's all solipsism, right? And my argument here is that ultimately atheism can't, as we mentioned earlier, this idea of the senses matching up to the external world. Do you actually know? And can you prove that there's an external world? I'm speaking logically here, right? So these are dilemmas that, again, atheist philosophers have raised, like David Hume, and the inability to prove these kinds of claims logically, all the way up to William Van Orman Quine and his 2 dogmas of empiricism, where he restates the arguments of Hume. A lot of these kinds of things you can't actually prove empirically. And this is why atheistic philosophy is so bankrupt, is that it actually doesn't understand the limitations that it puts itself in to actually undermine logic itself, to undermine philosophy. And so if all that exists is material, matter, then not only can you not know that, because that's actually a metaphysical claim, it's a universal claim, first of all, you can't actually ultimately know that the external world is not just a projection of your own psyche. And some have gone in that direction. Some people actually do believe that. And I would say that, so again, if you know the history of Western philosophers, when they debate this kind of topic, they come to that conclusion because they say things like, well, if we're just basing our worldview on our sense data, all we have is impressions, right? Like solidity, senses of smell, sight, right? Those are just sort of things that impress themselves upon us. We don't actually know what's out there in the external world itself, right? At what Kant called the Ding an sich. We only know the phenomenal experiences that we have. So it's entirely possible, if you think about a dream state, right, that all of those exterior sense impressions that are being pressed upon us are just mental phantasms, right? And if they're just mental phantasms, then we don't actually know if there's an external world, and you can't empirically demonstrate that. This is the kind of question that Descartes raises, right? Now, I don't believe that as a Christian. I believe obviously there's an external world. What I'm saying is that atheistic philosophy, because it basically takes what we would say is true of the mind of God, and it tries to smush that into the mind of man. And ultimately, in atheism, man tries to take on the role of God. It's man attempting to, in a Promethean sense, be God, and it still believes in God. It still has the attributes and necessity for God, but it all places that within the mind of finite, meaningless man. What is man in this system? He's just a drop of dust, a bag of human cells, a bag of cells, basically chemical reactions in an infinite, vast universe of meaninglessness, doing meaningless things, bubbling over, right? Your words, this is just chemical reactions. There's no meaning here. And then he turns back to dust. It's meaningless. And yet he spends his time, his days fighting theism, fighting the things that he thinks are suppressing. Why do you even care about people being suppressed, right? Why do you care about superstition? Why do you care about being noble, fighting for what's true, being rational, being logical? It's a giant, meaningless universe. So those things are all meaningless. I remember being at a debate one time, again, I always bring this up because it's a great example, where the atheist, after the debate, came over to us and was talking, and he said, I don't get your argument. He said, I think that really ultimately the real root of all this, he said, is that you are afraid to embrace the fact that the universe is ultimately meaningless. I said, do you really believe that? He said, yeah, absolutely. I said, so would that mean that you believe your own life is meaningless? And he said, absolutely. And I'm not afraid to say that. He said, I have the courage to own up to admitting that my life is meaningless. And I said, well, if your life is meaningless, that would mean that this day today is meaningless, right? He said, yeah, sure. It's all meaningless. I said, if this day today that we're experiencing right now is meaningless, does that also mean that the conversation, the words that you're saying to me are meaningless? And he sat there for a minute and he said, I'm tempted to bite the bullet here, but you're just playing word games. Well, of course, you have to bite the bullet here, right? If you believe that that's all meaningless, then you're part of this meaningless thing, and your arguments are meaningless. And if your arguments are meaningless, then I have done my job as an apologist to show the incoherence and the foolishness of this position. And so once again, that's an example of the transcendental argument, where somebody's utilizing something that's completely incoherent on their position, but it actually makes sense. If God exists and the world is as we believe in Christianity, then there are metaphysical principles. There are ethical absolutes. There is the possibility of having knowledge and certitude. There is regularity in nature because of divine providence. But on that system, there's not, and it's all meaningless. So I would say that atheism, as we said, assumes all of these standards. This is my ninth reason. And this includes things like morals and absolutes, right? It assumes the things that are necessary to refute Christianity that only make sense within a theistic or Christian worldview to try to argue against it. And so it's essentially sitting on the limb like a cartoon character as it saws the limb off, right? Let me give an example of this. If you think about Wittgenstein says all words are word games. Language is just word games. It's just tricking people. It's just this kind of stuff. He says that ultimately, if you just deconstruct all language, is meaningless. But he just wrote a book with 100, 200 pages admitting words are meaningless, using words that are to convince you that words are meaningless. So he's conveying meaning, an objectively true thing, he thinks, utilizing meaninglessness, and ultimately saying his book is meaningless. That's a basic presuppositional critique. It's nonsense. It's foolishness. All atheism ends in this very same bucket, trash bin of foolishness and philosophical incoherence at a fundamental level. Lastly, I would say that if you look at atheism, for all of its claims of being rational, being scientific, it relies on outstanding, outlandish miracles. It relies on things like knowing that there was the past. It relies on claims about aeons ago, what happened 11 million, what the monkey was doing literally 11 million years ago in Africa, right? Jacques Attali talks about this. Totally not observed. No one has observed this. You don't observe the transitions between these so-called species. There's no observations of things. They're just postulated, and they're usually argued for on the basis of authority. appeals to authority, right? So you can't prove the self. The self is assumed in every argument that the atheist uses to argue against Christianity. You can't prove meaning. And yet, as we saw, the atheist argues that the the universe ultimately is meaningless as he utilizes words to argue against words and meaning. You can't know or prove the past. These are, again, transcendental categories. But yet these things are magically believed to exist and to have occurred. And ultimately, the whole world coming out of nothing, the Big Bang, right? Magical superstition. All the Big Bang is a original miracle for secular atheists. And it's ludicrous. All mass was compacted into a tiny infinitesimal dot, and then it exploded. That's total nonsense. Total baloney. Something came from nothing. That's absurd. Consciousness came from nothing. Those are called miracles, secular miracles. And ultimately, through the transcendental argument, we consistently deconstruct and show that these positions are nonsense and are absurd. And they can't do. That's why you get people like Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, "Don't do philosophy. Stay away from that realm. I don't even mess with it. It's all nonsense." Oh yeah, exactly, because it shows the absurdity of this worldview.